Charlotte Niese, Die falschen Weihnachtsbäume, 1895. Translated title, The Fake Christmas Trees. On our island there were barely any trees. So few, in fact, that firewood had to be brought over by boat, and that most islanders had never seen a forest. Of course, that meant that Christmas trees, too, were a very rare commodity, and therefore a cause of much excitement for us children. After all, even as Christmas was fast approaching, it was still a very much open question on whether we would get to celebrate Christmas Eve with a real tree, grown in the forest in whose branches birds had once sung, or a fake one that had been created in the workshop of Master Arends. Master Arends was our carpenter. He was an elderly-looking fellow with a balding head, who we quite liked, as long as he wasn't yet again going on about his good heart. That whole spiel always bored us, since it seemed quite obvious that one simply has to have a good heart. Arends was a regular guest at our house, because things in our playroom, which were meant to be together, seemed to have an odd habit of going apart. And Master Arends would then appear, talk about his good heart, and glued whatever thing had come apart back together. We would obviously help him with this, but never without first bickering at length over who would get the honor of giving his sticky glue pot 3 good stirs. Yet his Christmas trees we still didn't like. The reason for that was probably that we got to see them for so long. Already in spring, Arends would begin work on long white poles, in which he drilled holes. During August and September, he would paint them green, and then dry them in front of his house. We would continue seeing them lying stacked in his workshop until December. That month, he would acquire fir branches that would then be plugged into the previously drilled holes. And then Master Arends would begin the very lucrative business of selling these fake trees. He would of course try selling them to us as well, and even though we could not deny that in the end these trees would look quite decent, we would still usually voice our disfavor for them. "They're cheap," he said to us while repainting one of the poles, on a particular day during which we had come to his workshop on an errand. "And we still don't want 'em," countered my brother Jürgen, who was always quite direct. "I don't like fake Christmas trees." "Fake? My word, dear boy," Master Arends looked quite insulted. "There's not an ounce of falseness in these. My trees are far finer than the natural ones, if anything. Those come coated in earth and grime. Mine only in this quality paint." "Where do you get those fir branches anyway?" we turned to ask. The old carpenter made a face as if he was about to clue us into a great secret, and then said, "From a forest, of course. A great forest, where the birds sing and the trees stand so thick one can hardly pass them." "And where's the forest? And who goes there to get the branches?" We had all gathered around and were looking at him with great suspense, but he simply shrugged. "Ha! Wouldn't you like to know? Well, I ain't telling ya. Not even a hint." And with that, he had managed to shroud his trees in mystery, which immediately raised our opinion of them. Christmas was already almost here, and understandably, we hardly talked about naught else. Endlessly long wish lists had been written, the occasional tear spilled over a ruined Christmas project, or we were planning on what else to give to someone. Time seemed out of whack, switching between a snail's crawl and an uncanny speed that saw hours reduced to mere seconds. And all throughout, our teachers complained bitterly about our absent-mindedness. It was a morning in December that I was sent to Master Arends to invite him and his glue pot over. Some parts of the playroom had suffered during a vigorous discussion between 2 of my elder brothers, and his services were needed. Merrily I rumbled up the narrow stairs of the workshop, only to be stopped at the head by another child standing there, to which the carpenter was speaking heatedly. "I must have those branches, and your father must go get them." "But father is afraid." "Bah! What is he bothering being afraid for? He's got to go, else I shall charge him for the money he owes me. Without those branches I can't finish the trees, and the business with them has to get going now. Now go, and tell your father to get going." The child, a tall girl, slid past me, and I was now able to enter the workshop and continue my errand, although Master Ahrens barely seemed to listen. He was in a foul mood, and kept sighing at the stack of green poles lying peacefully in the corner. "Can't get any branches from the big forest?" I asked nosily. He gave me a stern look. "Don't ask stupid questions, child. I can do anything I wish to, and my trees are still better than the natural ones." When I left the shop, I found the tall girl still sitting on the doorstep. She wasn't crying, though she looked very much like she wanted to, and so I sat myself next to her and looked at her in silence. Her clothes were obviously of poor make, but they were clean and neatly kept. Only her thick blonde hair hung in a tangled mass from her head. By this hair I finally recognized her, and gave her a friendly nod. "Now I remember you. You once brought me my textbook to school after I had lost it on the way. Remember?" She raised her head a bit, and her eyes looked a bit less overcast. "Aye, and such a nice textbook that was," she answered. "Even had pictures in it." "You don't have such a textbook?" I asked, somewhat shamed by the thought that I had dropped that very same textbook behind a sideboard at least 2 times already, just to be rid of it. Regrettably, it had been found each time. She shook her head. "Nah, I ain't got nothing." "Oh, so what did you wish for Christmas?" "Me?" She looked somewhat perplexed. "Why would I wish for anything? I'm not getting anything anyway." "You aren't getting anything?" I instinctively moved closer to her. "Aren't you really sad on Christmas, then?" "Nah," she laughed. "Why would I be sad? I get to walk around all night and enjoy looking at everyone's Christmas tree. Sometimes I even get gifted some rice and bread. But you shouldn't be walking around on your own on Christmas Eve. You should be at home with your parents." "Well, if father ain't locked up, I do stay with him, but these days he seems to always be in the stocks. So I'd be all alone at home, since Mom's dead." "He's in prison?" If it would have been possible, I would have moved even closer to my new acquaintance. However, we already sat nestled shoulder to shoulder, so, to further show how much I cared, I opened my little bag and offered her some dried plums I had stashed away. Dörte Krieger, that was the girl's name, and she ate from the offered fruits enthusiastically, while I looked on. As it was, I had just recently read a gripping story about an innocent prisoner, and from that I had come to the conclusion that prisons exclusively existed to torture the innocent. So I asked, "Your father surely hasn't done anything evil, right?" Dörte shook her head. "Nah, course not. Just a bit of thieving, nothing more. The mayor is just such a stick in the mud. Still, for those fir branches from Holstein, he don't want to try any more." "Wait, he's stealing those too?" "Yeah, course. How else he was gonna get 'em? They come from a tree, and that tree belongs to a count who's an ass, and hates it if people as much as wonder about his forest. But Daddy says the forest is so big, and there are so many deers and rabbits in it, that nobody could honestly notice if there's a tree less, or if one of the deers goes missing. Ever had deer roast? It's amazing. I'll ask Dad to give you a piece next time he brings some home. But this year he doesn't want to go. See, the gamekeeper's got a grudge with him, and they'd surely throw him in prison without as much as a second thought, if they as much as see him. and he's got to sit longer every time he's thrown in. Then surely he shouldn't go to the big forest, I affirmed. I wasn't sure why, but for some reason I had gotten quite a bad feeling about this whole affair. But Master Arends demands it, and we live in his house. Dörte had now risen and was rubbing her eyes. He says that Dad just needs to be more careful, and that he should pass on the deer, even if it's a golden opportunity. I could not think of any advice for her, but I could very much empathize with Dörte's desire not to see her father imprisoned over Christmas. After this, we split, but not before she made me promise not to tell a soul about what we had just spoken about. Jürgen was in the know about the entire story within 15 minutes, and it was a good thing that I had told him. As it turned out, I had done something terribly naughty, and I would have to make sure that no adult would catch wind of it. If they found out that I had talked with Dörte Krieger, I was sure to not get a single present for Christmas. Her father is a thief, and a terrible one at that, Jürgen told me. Rasmussen has just recently told me about it. Would you believe it? He doesn't even steal money. He really the finest thing to steal. Nah, he just goes and steals sausages and hams. He basically lives in prison. Dörte had of course already informed me about this rather depressing quirk of her father's. She just doesn't want him in there over Christmas, I tried to explain. She'd be all alone again and wouldn't have anyone to even recite her Christmas verses to. She doesn't get a single present at all. Nothing? Jürgen's firm face melted somewhat. But he too did not know any good advice, other than to stop thinking about Dörte and, most importantly, not to talk to her, especially just before Christmas. If the adult family members would notice what bad company I was keeping, my chances of bountiful gifts would surely plummet. Jürgen was a bit of a lecturer sometimes, and he himself had gotten several lectures recently about the bad company he had kept, so he knew exactly what to say, and I listened diligently. Dörte Krieger had, after all, eaten all my plums without so much as a word of thanks, clearly a sign of a bad heart. So when we met each other again some days later, she gave me a friendly nod, and I tried my very best not to even spare her a glance. But having passed her, I could not stop myself, and turned around to look at her. And since she had done the same, our eyes met. She laughed. I, however, was caught off guard. "You're not allowed to look at me. Your father is a terrible thief, and I don't want to talk to you." Dörte shook her head, shaggy hair flying about, and kept laughing. "Well, I ain't gonna make ya. The other kids at school don't want to sit near me either. And just yesterday I sat alone on my bank the entire day. That was nice." "You like sitting alone?" Despite my intentions, I had stepped closer to the thief's child and looked curiously on her carefree face. "Well, sure I do. Means none can pinch or push me. That's mighty fine, right?" "Was your father already to the forest?" She shook her head. "Nah, he had a bad knee, and couldn't go so far. Arends was livid, I tell ya. Threatened to throw us out of our home if father doesn't get going soon. I don't care if he goes. I just don't want to see him gone on Christmas again." She sighed and pushed her arms under her thin shawl. Who am I kidding? I know what'll happen," she continued. "Daddy'll go to the forest, wanting to just take some branches, and he'll see a deer, and he'll catch it, and then the cops will come, and all the bad men, and they'll stick him in the stocks again, all throughout Christmas." "Did you learn a Christmas verse for him?" I tried to interject, but she didn't seem to hear me at all. "If only it was just Easter or Whitsun, I wouldn't even care. It's just not so dark then, and the other kids wouldn't be talking about Christmas trees or poems either. But now—" Dörte wiped her eyes and gave me a helpless look. "Didn't you tell your father not to go?" "'Course I did. But what would Arends do if he doesn't get those branches? We owe him at least 2 years' worth of rent after all. Perhaps you could pray to God and ask that he makes it so that your father won't find any deer when he goes to the forest. That might just work. I shall ask him to make it so that the deer are all away, or that the Count will have them all butchered. For the branches, that would only get a little prison." She left, and I remembered that I had intended not to speak with her. Thank God nobody had seen me. Many thoughts filled my heart at the time, and I had soon enough forgotten the conversation, so that I didn't even tell Jürgen about it this time. After all, Christmas was barely more than a week away, and I was filled with that odd, prickly restlessness that every child knows during this season. We could hardly be made to sit still any more, and spent all our time running about our small town, looking at all the Christmas decorations, gifts, and attractions on display. At the same time, we were plagued by worries about our tree, which was to be brought by a skipper who would sail his boat to Lübeck each season to bring our island all kinds of ordered Christmas supplies. But Skipper Lafrenz hadn't returned to port, and that was caused by bad winds, we were told by the people at the harbor. An explanation that only stoked our worries. We were, after all familiar with stories of people who had spent weeks tacking against bad winds on the Baltic, only to fail to reach their destination, having to return home empty-handed. And even though we had not borne witness to something like this ourselves, we had been fed so many stories of misadventurous sea journeys that we could clearly imagine the small boat carrying our Christmas tree stuck in the ice somewhere on a Finnish shore. The adults attempted to soothe our worries, but we still felt it was our solemn duty to go to our small port every day and ask of news of the Anna Katrin. That was the ship of Skipper Lafrenz. A beautiful ship, really, though she did have a tendency to roll a lot, even whether it seemed entirely unreasonable. On the Sunday before Christmas, we were graced with wonderful weather. It seemed almost as if the sun had decided to overturn the seasons. It was as bright as spring, and when we left church that day, we decided to once again visit the port and ask about the Anna Katrin. When we came past Master Ahrens's workshop, we saw him standing in front of it holding a Christmas tree, a fake one, naturally, and its branches were no longer fresh. "Where did you get those twigs, Master Ahrens?" we promptly asked. "That's a pretty sad-looking Christmas tree." The carpenter did not answer, and simply grumbled some frustrated words into his beard, prompting one of our older brothers to report that the trade in fir branches had been slow this year. Nobody selling quality ones had come to the island, making even the fake trees costly. We all bemoaned the bad fortune, and set off with even greater urgency towards the harbor, to begin our watch for the Anna Katrin. But no matter how much we strained our eyes, none of us could make out her patched sails on the horizon. Frustrated, our older brothers left to visit a friend, whose uncle owned a spyglass that would hopefully help us finally get a glimpse of the boat that we were all anxiously waiting for. We younger ones, on the other hand, went down to the beach and tried to dispel our dour mood by skipping stones on the water. As we did so, we came across a small rowboat tied down near the water with both paddles in it, and that was such a tempting opportunity that we immediately brought it to water, clambered aboard, and began rowing about the beachfront. The boat was in a terrible condition. The seats were rotten, and the planks of the vessel seemed to be held together more with good hope rather than nails. We, however, cared little about that, and we merrily rocked along the small waves. Jürgen confidently insisted that he could even reach the coast of nearby Holstein, which you could see barely on the horizon. Of course he couldn't actually, and while we were fighting over the oars, he lost his grip on one of them, letting it fall into the water. It too rocked merrily along, all the while we looked rather stupid as it swam away. We looked even more stupid when, in an attempt to catch the runaway, Jürgen managed to lose the other oar as well. Loud cursing came now from the beach, and a man with tall, waterproofed boots was wading through the water towards us, pulling both the boat and one of the oars back to the beach, as well as us, of course. The first oar, however, had gotten away, and he shot us a very angry glare. You idiotic brats! What are you doing in my boat? Get out, before I throw you into the water. And where's the other oar? He was understandably rather livid. When Jürgen whispered to me, however, that this was Jobst Krieger, the thief, a self-righteous spite came over me, and though I vacated the boat rather quickly, I did snidely remark, "You've got no right to tell us off." "And why's that?" asked a man whose face didn't actually look very scary at all. "You are a thief and a bad person," I said. Jürgen, who had now also firm ground underfoot, nodded along to my words. "You aren't even allowed to talk to us," he added, "'cause you're always sent to the prison." Jobst Krieger looked flabbergasted for a moment, but then he turned a very dark shade of red. "How is it any of your business if I've been in prison? Plenty of very proper men have been to prison. Moreover," he took a very long and careful look at each one of us, "I know you lot. How many times have y'all been to visit the old miller, That old sack spent half his life in the penitentiary." "Penitentiary is much finer than prison," Jürgen shot back. "Much finer. I talked with the miller about it. He explained it to me. Besides, he hasn't been sent there nearly as many times as you've been sent to the stocks." "Ha! Well, no. He did all his time in one go," Jobst Krieger admitted laughingly. His anger over the lost oar seemed to have left him, and honestly, his face really didn't look like that of a bad man. With heavy steps, he started to push the boat out towards the water again. "Where are you going?" asked my other brother, Milo, who up until now had merely looked on steadily as the situation unfolded. Jobst did not answer. I, on the other hand, now remembered Dörte, all the while forgetting that I had promised to keep our conversation secret. "He's going to the big forest on the mainland, where the deer and rabbits are plentiful, and he's going to cut down fir trees and catch deer, until the evil count comes and catches him. And then Dörte is going to walk the streets on her lonesome on Christmas Eve again, because her father is locked up in prison." "Hogwash," Job said. He had been scooping water out of the little boat, but now he had stopped and looked at us again. "Is not," I yelled indignantly. "Dörte said that if at least you'd only steal on Easter or Whitsun, she wouldn't care. But really, on Christmas? You aren't allowed to steal on Christmas. No, you really are not." Both Jürgen and Milo agreed. "I mean, that's when the spirit of Christmas is coming among us. And if it finds you in a prison cell, you won't get any gifts. Only good people get gifts, after all." "I'm not getting any gifts no matter what," he grumbled. He had listened to us until this point, but now returned to scooping water out of the boat. "But you could," Jürgen interjected. "If you don't sit in prison this Christmas, I'll gift you something. I built a chest as a Christmas project, and it turned out really well, so I wanted to keep it for myself. But if you promise to be good, I'll gift it to you." "And I shall make you a ring made of black glass pearls," exclaimed an excited Milo, who was an acclaimed master in the art of wasting pearls. "Or if you'd like a blue ring, I could make you one of those, maybe even with a gold pearl. Those are terribly expensive, but I'll do it." "And I would give Dörte my picture textbook," I added, and came a bit closer towards Jobst Krieger, who had set himself into the boat and looked at us rather perturbed. He was probably too overwhelmed by our amazing offers to immediately accept. "Look," I murmured conspiratorially to him, "let Dörte get that book. It's really pretty, so if the other children see it, they will surely want to sit next to her. She really doesn't want you to be locked up again. She's always got to sit alone in class, and if you are gone, well, she'd be alone even on Christmas. I told her to pray for you to be home, but she must have forgotten, as surely God wouldn't have denied her this if she'd asked nicely." Jobst Krieger landed the boat again and stepped out of it. He looked troubled and unhappy, and when Jürgen went on to once more extol his chest's beauty, Jobst only answered with an incomprehensible growl. Another man was now joining him, having come from the town. He seemed a lot less nice than Jobst, and he kept a cautious eye on us as he was talking silently with him. We decided to leave. Jürgen and I left first, and Milo followed us, after milling about for a few more minutes on the beach. I was able to listen in on him, he explained once he rejoined us. The other man's name was Lorenz, and he wanted to go with Jobst to the big forest by boat. But Jobst told him that he wasn't in the mood for it anymore, and that they should go tomorrow. He said he would need to find his courage again. Lorenz got angry at that, and he said he wasn't gonna go on a Monday. That day is bad luck. He was going this Sunday, and he wasn't going to wait for Jobst to get his act together. They got heated with each other, and now the other guy is in the boat, and Jobst is leaving. Our older brothers returned now, but they were in such low spirits due to their failure to spot the Anna-Katrin even with the help of the spyglass, that we outright forgot to report to them what had transpired on the beach. Only in the evening did our thoughts return to Jobst Krieger, and after some talk we agreed that it was probably pointless to prepare gifts for him. Milo, however, started to work on the blue pearl ring regardless, which turned out very pretty. That night the island was swept by a sudden, terrible storm. The mild December sun had turned out to be deceptive. The wind turned, and rain whipped the windows, and roof shingles were ripped off the houses and smashed on the streets. By morning things had calmed again, and the brothers went to the harbor to look for Anna-Katrin, who chose to finally turn up and enter harbor. Somewhat worse for wear, as the storm had been even worse out of sea, but she was a tough old gal. And whilst our Christmas tree was now finally within arm's reach, we could not quite bring ourselves to rejoice. Our mood had been turned by Skipper Lovrens, reporting to have come across an overturned boat near the island, one that he had recognized as belonging to the man named Lorenz, who apparently was just as infamous as Jobst Krieger. At the harbor, some had known that Lorenz and Jobst had planned to make a journey with that boat, and some claimed to have seen them both leave together. Now both were presumed to have drowned, after being surprised by the storm at sea. A terrible, sad story, not at all fitting for the Christmas season, and we talked about it at length. We were all devastated that Jobst had ultimately chosen to go. Milo more than any of us. He could hardly believe it. But Lorenz must have browbeaten him into coming after we left. Grandfather Scribe Rasmussen, however, was not saddened at all. He stated confidently that Jobst would have simply ended locked up anyhow, since he could not stop stealing. Gathering branches in the wood wasn't a crime after all, but he would always hack apart the most beautiful firs to get his hands on fresh branches. He reminded us that the fool would always go on and poach deers and rabbits, and that no larder was safe from the thief. Master Arends might have had a good supplier in him, and his artificial treats might suffer in quality because of this, but that was just comeuppance in his books. In fact, it was a good thing the thief was dead, he finished. Regardless of his words, we stayed deeply upset, and for quite a while we forgot all Christmas cheer. Worse was how shamed we felt that we were crying over a common thief. But that we did. Despite his failings, and the fact that we had only known him for a short time, we had come to like Jobst. And suddenly my thoughts returned to Dörte. What was she going to do now that her father had drowned? All the rest of the day I could not stop thinking of her, and Jürgen and Milo talked about her as well. Now she was all alone, not just on Christmas, but on Easter and Whitday, and for the rest of her life. Currently, cakes and cookies were being baked at our home, and this provided a pleasant distraction. But as the sun began to set, I decided that I had to go to Dörte Krieger after all. The way to her home I knew quite well at this point, even if I had never entered. Jürgen decided to accompany me, and we managed to coax a care package from mother, filled with fresh cake for poor Dörte. In the small, decayed cottage on the edge of town, light could be seen in one of the windows. After we had rushed through the unlocked house door and almost fell into the small, shabbily furnished living room, we recoiled in shock. There, on a footstool, illuminated by a tallow candle, sat Jobst Krieger, and he had a visitor. In front of him stood Master Ahrens, who spoke to him with great severity. We, however, completely ignored the old carpenter, and ran straight to Jobst, scrutinizing him closely. "What?" yelled Jürgen. "You aren't dead?" His voice had a reproachful tone, and I too had a hard time not feeling somewhat resentful. I mean, really, if you go through the trouble of mourning for someone, that someone should have the common courtesy not to immediately get back up again. Jobst Krieger gave us a sheepish look. "Lorenz went alone," he said. "I didn't want to. I did." He stopped and stroked his face. "You got very lucky, Jobst Krieger," Master Arns remarked. "If you had gone with Lorenz, you would be dead on the bottom of the sea. That man was such a piece of work, always inciting you to greater mischief. Now, tomorrow, you will go to the mainland and get me those branches. That's your last chance." But Jobst only shook his head. "No, Master Arns, I won't be getting those fir branches for you. If I go into that wood—" He took a sharp breath. "I won't be able to stop myself. I'll go and get my hands on things that aren't mine to own, and it'll be another lonely Christmas for my daughter. And now that God saw fit to spare me from death—" He stopped again and looked at us. We gave him supportive nods. We had forgotten our resentment over his survival. Master Ahrens, however, wrung his hands. "Well, that would mean I can't make any decent Christmas trees, just when the business is busiest, and you, living in my house, won't do what I want. Well, I suppose you'll just have to get out by New Year's then." We had never seen Master Ahrens get so vicious, and he had now our full attention. "Sail over to the forest and get those branches yourself," Jürgen said angrily. The old man shot him a dark glare. "I could come to harm doing that," he muttered. My brother stepped up to him. "Master Ahrens, didn't you just tell us recently that it's the most important thing in life to have a good heart? Do you have a good heart?" I do most certainly," the old man assured in an uncertain voice. "But the Christmas trees need branches, or they'd be Christmas sticks, and if Jobst Krieger won't get those branches—" "He doesn't want to be a thief any more," interrupted Jürgen. "Leave him be, and go to Skipper Lafrenz. He returned today, and he has brought loose branches as well as whole trees. My brother saw it." "Truly?" Ahrens's angry face softened a bit, and then he ran off quickly, without so much as a goodbye. Not that we cared. We unpacked our cakes, and since we had forgiven Jobst for surviving, he was allowed to sample them. Jürgen and I sung him our Christmas verses, mostly for the practice, but also because we just couldn't get them out of our heads anymore. We were somewhat sulky about his failure to compliment us on them, but he simply sat before us and had both arms folded before his face. Frankly, he was so still that once we had both finished our verses with an "Amen," we found ourselves somewhat creeped out. To our luck, Dörte broke that moment by tumbling into the living room. Her surprise at our presence was great, and her delight over the cake we had brought even greater, so that we all grew cheerful again. Eventually, Jobst Krieger stood up and said that he would bring us home. Our parents wouldn't like us staying with him for so long, after all. We had to agree with that, and soon we were walking alongside him on the dark road. The silence of the nightly walk was disturbed by Jürgen, who gave a heavy sigh. "Jobst, it's a terrible shame that you're a bad man. I really like you. Far better, in fact, than plenty of people who never went to prison. Me too, I assured him. Jobst stood still for a moment and then softly put his hands on our heads. I'm sorry enough about it myself, he murmured. We could not understand what he said after that. His voice had grown terribly hoarse. But he vanished into the darkness, and we had to go the rest of the way alone. Not that that was bad. We weren't scared, and we knew the way, and had plenty of things to talk about, which only grew in number once we arrived home and reported to our siblings that Jobskrieger had survived. We soon had grand plans for things we should gift him for Christmas. Father's old suits, which didn't belong to us, foodstuffs that weren't at our disposal, but most importantly a catechism, so that he could more easily relearn the 10 Commandments. But things turned out differently. On the day before Christmas, when we had planned to invite both Jobst and his daughter to celebrate with us, we found out that they had disappeared the night prior. They had left the island without bothering to even take their meager possessions. All throughout the entirety of Christmas we hoped to see them return, but they did not, and nobody could even tell us where they had gone. Their sudden disappearance put a heavy damper on our cheer, and we were only able to slowly recover it by reminding ourselves that at least now no one would forbid us from thinking and talking about Jobst and Dörte. In the end, our Christmas was a joyful one, and we went on to give the presents intended for Jobst to others who had need of them. Only Master Ahrens was denied a happy Christmas. Firstly, because his fake Christmas trees had been very disappointing affairs this year, even with the branches he had managed to get. And secondly, because the islanders now started to consider that perhaps he had pressed Jobst too hard all these years, and led him to go steal in the forest. Whether he was truly or entirely to blame, no one could agree on, but for this season at least he walked about stooped over and looking rather miserable, complaining about bad times and bad people. Several winters had come and gone. Master Ahrens was still making fake, ugly Christmas trees, and we only rarely talked about Jobst anymore. At first we had speculated that he must have gone to America, and that he would come back a rich man. Dörte would be wearing silken dresses, and he would give us all amazing Christmas gifts. We argued long about what would be better, a golden cup or a golden plate. But with time we almost started to forget about him, until one Christmas, when an odd package arrived. It had Jürgen's, Milo's, and my name on it, and it came from a place somewhere in Prussia, or so our parents told us. The package contained a cleanly carved boat, filled with Christmas roses, and placed upon nicely smelling fir twigs. Included was a note that was written in an unpracticed hand. It came a flower bright amid the cold of winter. We knew at once that this had been sent by Jobskrieger, and we were delighted. He had even remembered at least parts of the Christmas verses we had sung him. And anyone who kept at least some of the Christmas verses within themselves could most certainly not be a bad person. Master Ahrens agreed. He too had gotten mail, of which he was certain that it was from Jobst, as it had included exactly as much money as he had been owed by him. Honestly, you really don't deserve that money, said Jürgen, who still hadn't quite forgiven the old carpenter for his callous behavior. Ahrens scratched his head and sighed. You're right, I don't. I shouldn't keep this for myself. These recent years I have been plagued by my conscience over this whole affair. I always did strive to keep a good heart. It was just that Christmas tree business. It was so lucrative, it got to my head. So Master Ahrens paid for the Christmas celebrations of several poorer families, something that made him speak even more frequently of his good heart. An odd coincidence, perhaps, was that the children of those families were among those who had been the most opposed to sitting next to Dörte Krieger in school. But that was all long in the past, and the fake Christmas trees from Ahrens shone brightly over them, and their joy was true. After all, the spirit of Christmas, in its grace, does neither ask about the achievements nor about the failures of the children of man. If it did, it would stop returning every year.